Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
In Rajputana, for example, the Maharana of Udaipur always had this habit of feigning diplomatic illnesses every time he had to go to Delhi and meet the British. So he would go to Delhi, and then once he got there, for these Delhi Darbars of 1903, 1911, he would then fall ill very conveniently so that he didn't have to participate in the processions that the Raj expected the Rajas to do, which is, they all get on their elephants and they sort of, look exotic and like tropical exhibits and flatter the British by coming out in all their diamonds and regalia. And Udaipur did not want to do it. And he would feign these illnesses, which again is not a case of princely eccentricity. It has political meaning. Why? Because if he does it, firstly, Udaipur always found he was placed behind the Maharaja of Baroda. And as a Rajput, he always found it somewhat offensive to have to stand behind a Maratha.
India's colonial experience was a complex phenomenon which took different shapes in different places through layers of caste, religious identity, and much else. In this episode of BIC Talks, author Manu S Pillai will explore how India's princely states and their rulers negotiated their political identities and ideas of kinship, both while facing pressures from the British Raj as well as while resisting it. Looking beyond the stereotypes in which princely rulers have been trapped, he investigates their experiments with transforming kingly identities, balancing relationships as much with the British as with the subjects, in constructing political visions for their states, sometimes of great ambition, and their ultimate disappearance from India's political map, even if not public imagination. This was the third Professor Satish Chandra Memorial Lecture, which took place in October 2021. And now, over to Manu.
My name is Alok Chandra, and I'm the eldest son of the late Professor Satish Chandra, in whose memory our family has instituted this annual memorial lecture on his death anniversary, which is today. He passed away in 2017 at the ripe old age of 95. The first memorial lecture was given live by Professor Irfan Habib in October 2019, and the second by Professor Romila Thapar in October 2020 online. Of course, we've all had to adapt to a Zoom life. So this third lecture is being given by Manu. After my opening address, I will hand over to Manu for the talk, which would last about 40 minutes. The session will conclude with my younger brother Akhil reading out questions received and for Manu to answer and giving a short vote of thanks. Professor Satish Chandra was best known as an authority on medieval Indian history. His PhD dissertation, Parties and Politics at the Mughal Court, used to be recommended reading for candidates aspiring for the UPSC examinations, while his History of Medieval India is one of the largest selling school textbooks on the subject. In all, Dad wrote 21 books over his many years. He spent teaching at various universities, starting with Allahabad University, went on to Aligarh Muslim University, Rajasthan University in Jaipur, University of Delhi, and finally the JNU, which he joined in 1970, from where he retired in 1995. In between, he was the vice chairman and then the chairman of the University Grants Commission, which has now been reconstituted. He was there from 73 to 81, which of course were fairly momentous years in our history. After retirement in 95, he went on to found the Society for Indian Ocean Studies, now headed by Ambassador Sudhir Devare, and which now has its own building in Ladusarai. The SIOS is essentially a think tank on social and naval matters relating to the Indian Ocean and its littoral states, the states around the perimeter of the Indian Ocean. And it also brings out a respected quarterly journal. I am immensely grateful to Manu for so readily agreeing to deliver this year's lecture. The subject is very interesting to a lot of people, both scholars and students, as well as observers and common people. And for me personally, as I was schooled at the Mayo College in Ajmer, which was set up in 1875 for the sons of the royal families of Rajasthan. The topic, rethinking the princely states, I think has emerged from his research done for his recently launched book, False Allies, India's Maharajas in the Age of Ravi Barwa. So without further ado, I request Manu to please come and deliver third memorial lecture.
It's a pleasure and a privilege and frankly an honor to be delivering this lecture. You, of course, have already discussed your father's achievements and his work, but as a student of history, one of the things you admire about Professor Chandra is the fact that he was somebody who broke down a lot of simplistic answers about history. He was somebody who never forgot that history was something that was complex, and in a sense, he complicated a lot of very received wisdom, ideas that were very simplistic, ideas that were too easy and far too convenient, and made us realize that there were layers, there was more to the picture than was visible as an easy, immediate glance. And I think that is essentially the task of any historian to this day, which is to complicate, complex, make the question more complex, ask more questions of a certain historical point or a position that we've heard or studied from before, and to constantly interrogate the past. Which brings me to the topic of today's lecture, which is about rethinking the Maharajas, because I believe they, as a class, as well as a period of history in which they were important and significant political players, they have often been reduced to caricature and stereotype. But if you just complicate the business a little more, if you just ask a few more questions, you start realizing that there was a lot more happening in the princely states. There was a lot that was of deep political, social, and cultural importance that was happening under the Maharajas, and that they were not necessarily just these despots on shiny thrones who sat around for 200 years till the British left and did nothing till the Indian state came and wiped them out. Now, usually speaking of the Maharajas, the stereotypes come to us very easily. All you need to do is look at a tourist brochure in Rajasthan and you'll see pictures of palaces, you'll see pictures of people in colorful clothes, you'll see talk of, old cars and horses and stables and elephants. Hear stories about a Raja who bought a bunch of Rolls-Royce cars and turned them into garbage vans. You will hear stories of a Raja who had hundreds of women in his harem and decided that, he was so prolific in terms of his romantic interest that where the Nizam of Hyderabad was called His Exalted Highness, this particular Raja was called His Exhausted Highness because he had so many wives. So these are the general stories that you hear about the Maharajas. A lot of them are obviously entertaining. They make for almost, comical accounts of history. They're very lively. And by no means is the claim that there weren't eccentric people or there weren't Maharajas who didn't do certain strange things. There must have been Rajas who had lots of wives. There must have been Rajas who drank champagne and whiled away their time. There must have been Rajas who did all kinds of strange and curious things. But I think it's important to realize that if a stereotype is brought out to sort of represent the sum totality of a class, the sum totality of a political space, then there's a kind of mischief there. And we must sort of peel back the layers a little bit and ask questions as to why is it that the stereotype dominates as opposed to a more serious understanding of that space. For example, royal eccentricities were not a monopoly that the Maharajas alone had. If you look at even Queen Victoria's son, he was a very difficult crown prince for her to deal with, had heaps of mistresses, got into all kinds of awkward situations, but he ended up becoming the king emperor of the British Empire. And we don't necessarily reduce that political phase and that political position of his life and his career to the things that he did as a young man. So too, somebody like Lord Curzon, who was one of the starchiest viceroys that India had, stiff upper lip, spine erect, often very literally because he used to wear an iron brace, very sort of proper. He also as a young man spent much of his time tumbling from one bed to the other. He had it in him to play lawn tennis naked once. So eccentricity or just these comical elements, they're part of human behavior. And it isn't that the Maharajas alone were engaged in such activities. How do we start to look at them more seriously? Now, the first thing is that, we think of Maharajas and or the princely states in India, and we think of 562 states. That's the usual number that's bandied about. Sometimes it's 700, sometimes it's 565. There isn't a clear number. One of the reasons there isn't a clear number is that these categories often changed. You would have a situation where in one particular count, certain zamindars were also included in something else, somebody else was not included, and so the numbers kept fluctuating. But even if you take 562 as the number of princely states, the constant repetition of that number, that till the British left, there were 562 princely states in India, that's also got a little bit of a conceptual mischief going on there, because what it does is it gives you the impression that you throw a stone in India and you hit a Raja. They were a dime a dozen, which meant that they weren't particularly serious. All of them ruling over small territories, all of them tin pot despots doing nothing that was very interesting. But then you sort of interrogate that number and you discover that over 300 of these were actually microscopic estates, really spread over a few square miles of territory, a lot of them concentrated in what we call Kathiawar. So that gets rid of over 300 states from the overall number. You keep investigating the number further still, and you discover that the real states, the principalities that merit the term state, which means a large population, a large enough revenue of, say, over 10 lakh rupees per annum, those were only about 100, some people 110, 112, but let's say just over 100 states actually merit the term of a princely state. So that itself breaks away the idea that you throw a stone and you hit a Raja, because in such a large subcontinent, 100 princes suddenly starts looking more serious as opposed to 562. The other thing is, conceptually, we often describe the princes as being subject to indirect rule. The British ruled what was called British India. And of course, these Rajas were just controlled by the British, and they were indirectly ruling these princely territories. Again, that term to me is slightly loaded politically, and it is loaded with some of these, with these problems that sort of tilt the field against the Rajas. Which is to say that, yes, the Rajas were susceptible to pressures from the British. They were susceptible to sometimes being toppled. One poor Raja even got beaten to death in the 1880s. These things did happen. But overall, the term indirect rule masks another way of looking at it, which is that if you have British ruled India, the rest of it under the Rajas, which is, about 2/5 of India's subcontinental territory, is under Indian rule. That is Indian ruled India. Yes, the British came as an imperial formation. Yes, the British came and sort of took over overlordship of these states. But on the ground, for millions of people who lived in these states, their direct intercourse was with their Raja, not with the white man. The white man wasn't as present in their lives as the Englishman was in British India. That itself tells you that the Rajas were ruling over Indian units through Indian institutions, of course, responding to new pressures and modernity and so on. But they were essentially Indians governing India, which is why one of the reasons the nationalists of the Congress party till as late as the 1920s saw many Rajas as heroes was precisely because of this. They saw that the princely states had been spared the worst of colonialism. Ultimately, in princely India, it was an Indian ruler with Indian ministers, Indian bureaucrats, all of them governing over Indians. Although under pressure, although squeezed by the Raj, it was still a place where Indians could shine, as opposed to British India. So even the term indirect rule versus, Indian ruled India, there's a little bit of, I think there's a correction that we require that needs to be made there. The other thing is, in Indian ruled India, why is Indian ruled India important? Partly because the general narrative, because we're preoccupied with British India, because we're preoccupied with the nationalist struggle, the conversations are often about Indians fighting the British. But what was happening in the states where the British were not directly visible, where anti-colonialism wasn't as big a plank as perhaps certain other things? That's where you discover the importance of casteism, communalism. A lot of the things we still see in our democratic politics in the 21st century, you actually find elements of that in the princely states, because they didn't have a common enemy in the form of the white man. This was Indian politicians dealing with the Raja. Some of the politicians in states like Travancore would sort of form their groupings around caste identity. So the Nayars would be one group, the Iravas would be one group, the Christians would be one group. And that's how Travancore politics was organized, not against the British. These were the groups jostling with each other. And it's quite funny that to this day in Kerala politics, the Nayar Irava element and the Christian element remains very active. And there are factions within the Congress party that are still based on these groups. To understand that, you need to actually go back to the princely state of Travancore. You take somewhere like Rajputana and you think that, the Raja has to deal with the British, who are his overlords, and they'll give him orders. And he's sort of sitting there and issuing arbitrary orders, constantly sitting on a silk sofa of sorts and issuing whatever he feels. And that's how princely states are run. But no, things were always a bit more complex within the states. The Rajput system, there was the king, there were his vassal lords. The vassal lords always challenged the king's authority. Just as the king had to deal with the British, the vassal lords dealt with the king. And just as the king dealt with pressure from the British, he had to deal with pressure from his courtiers. And it could be quite intense pressure. As late as the 1930s, you have an armed rebellion set off by a vassal lord of the Maharaja of Jaipur. So these vassals were important political figures in their own right. All the same, you have peasants and peasant unrest that often forces the hand of the Raja. You have tribal unrest because the Bhils in Rajputana through the 19th century, you find, and of course before that also, but through the 19th century in the colonial period, you see them standing up to the Rajas. So the Rajas were never sitting in a position of complete comfort simply because the British protected them. And nor were they in a position to rule arbitrarily and do as they wished. They had various pressures working within, they had various pressures outside. And it was precisely as political figures that they had to balance these different pressures. And it would vary from state to state. So in a state like Baroda, for example, you have a Maratha royal family ruling over Gujaratis. So the fault lines over there are slightly different. In Rajputana, as I said, there are tribals, there are peasants, there are the vassal lords. The fault lines are slightly different. In Kerala, you have an orthodox ruler, but you have a community like the Iravas who are a former lower caste moving up and claiming political clout. Again, the issues there are different. So each of these states is diverse. Each of these states is different. It's by putting this together that we can construct a better image of what is modern Indian history. To reduce modern Indian history to, essentially what was happening in British India and to the process of standing up to the Raj, it sort of eclipses the experience of millions of people, of whole communities, of whole political institutions in the princely states, some of whom have continuities going back a long time. So the Nizam of Hyderabad, for example, had these subordinate Samasthan states, which were ruled by Hindu Rajas. Some of them actually trace their genealogy back into the 13th century, into the age of the Kakatiyas. So although the Kakatiyas were their overlords first, then the Sultans of Delhi, then the Bahmani Sultans, then say the Qutub Shah of Golconda, then the Nizam of Hyderabad, down to 1949, those rulers ruled over that same chunk of territory with just these overlords changing. It tells you also about the larger span of Indian history, where between the British and the Indian people, there is this layer of Indian authority and Indian power that is extremely important. But leaving that aside, it wasn't as though the Rajas did not stand up to the British either. One example I can give you is of a gentleman called Tukoji Rao Holkar. He was the Maratha ruler of Indore. Indore was, of course, set up in the 18th century by the Holkar dynasty. Its most famous ruler, whom even the British admired, was Ahilyabai Holkar. If you read Malcolm's work from the early 19th century, he calls her a model of good government and so on. And it was she who set up very high standards of administration in the late 18th century. But Tukoji Rao Holkar and his dealings with the British are quite fascinating. In 1877, there was what was called one of these Delhi Darbars, where the British basically gathered together the Rajas and said, you must all come and, pay homage to Queen Victoria. She wasn't present in person, but she had just assumed the title of Empress of India. And she had claimed that imperial mantle of the Mughals for herself. And at this Darbar, various Rajas were invited, and they all came and sort of, declared allegiance to the British. And there's this interesting letter that the Indore Raja writes then, where he says, India has been till now a vast heap of stones, some of them big, some of them small. It was thanks to the British that now the house is built, and from roof to basement, each stone is in the right place. Which, on the face of it, you would think, he's groveling, what a slavish man, completely playing up to the British and sucking up and saying that, without you, India would have just fallen apart and you've come and saved Indians. What's interesting is that despite this letter, which on the face of it suggests complete loyalism, why is it that privately the British describe the same Raja, and I'm quoting, as a chief whose disloyalty is notorious and who by intriguing in every possible manner presented the Raj with persistent opposition? That is to say, in public, the Raja's got this oily language that he's using, but in private, he's constantly described as disloyal, which then poses the question. If somebody looks, he's come for the Darbar, he's paying homage to Queen Victoria, he's writing this kind of slavish letter to the Raj, then why is he still considered disloyal? That's where you sort of peel back the layers and you start looking at the Rajas seriously, and you discover that in 1857, as a young ruler of Indore, his army decided to attack the British. The Raja very shrewdly said that, he had lost control of his army, but subsequent research suggests that that's not actually true. In fact, he may have looked the other way quite deliberately while his army took control of his arms and ammunition and went out against the British. So there was that element which was hanging over his head. Through the 1860s and 70s, he would fight with the Raja on all kinds of things. The British had planned to take over Mysore state and sort of, kick out the Vadiyars and keep it for themselves. He was lobbying, he was paying money and actually sending people to London and canvassing people to help the Mysore family get back what was their due. Similarly, the state of Dhar, he was helping its rulers argue the case, and they had actually been deposed because of disloyalty in 1857. He was arguing the case that no, the British do not have a right to remove them from power and the kingdom must be returned to the rulers of Dhar. That was, so he's meddling with things the British don't want him meddling in. The British had this rule that princes are not supposed to have contacts with each other, but in reality, the princes always had contacts with each other under the nose of the British. They had no idea that these contacts were taking place, but they were. Similarly, Dadabhai Naoroji, who was one of the earliest Indians to be elected into the House of Commons in London, we often forget that he was originally a diwan in a princely state in Baroda. He also saw the princely states as extremely important to articulating a nationalist message, to articulating what, power and freedom and independence and autonomy would mean to Indians. Dadabhai Naoroji had set up in London an organization called the East Indian Association, which was basically, if you want to be pejorative, you can say it was like a debating club where people came and just gave grand lectures and speeches and had debates, like a gentleman's society. But it was about Indian issues in London, and it did aggravate the British a great deal. If you read Dinyar Patel's biography of Dadabhai Naoroji, you'll see the importance of the East India Association in that time. And Tukoji Rao Holkar made a grand donation once of 25,000 rupees to Dadabhai Naoroji for his association. Now, in those days, 25,000 rupees was a ton of money. The association did not have that kind of funding. And Tukoji was not the only one. There were a lot of other Rajas who were also funding Dadabhai Naoroji's organization. In fact, his election to the House of Commons was also funded by a lot of Rajas because they had an incentive also in having a black man or a brown man in London needling the British from there. So they were not meek, they were not submissive. And when Tukoji Rao Holkar made this donation, he actually, in a letter that's written at that time, the Raja's secretary, he didn't write it himself, his secretary did. He basically justifies making the donation because he thinks the East India Association is in patriotic exertions in the UK, and he's trying to support that. And he says the East India Association is conveying the true picture of India to the British. On the face of it, it doesn't feel like problematic language, but what he's essentially saying is patriotic exertions is language the British don't like. And when he says that the East India Association is making known to the British public the true state of things in India, implicit in it is the idea that the British government is not telling the people in London, the people in the UK, what they're actually up to in India, and that things in India are worse than they might appear from Britain. This was why the British thought of him as a disloyal man. In fact, in the 1870s, he by no means was Tukoji Rao Holkar some kind of ideal ruler. He was an autocrat, but he maintained his finances well. He brought in the railways, he set up these cotton mills, etc. So in terms of revenue, because he was in control of his state, the British found it very difficult to interfere. And when they tried, he would fight back. He knew exactly how to push back on pressure that way. And when in the 1870s, he brought a very accomplished Indian native statesman, as they were called in those days, because in those days, statesmen could only be white. So if you were a brown statesman, you were called a native statesman. So he brings in a native statesman called Sir T. Madhav Rao, who's got experience turning around the administration of Travancore in the south, who's a very respected administrator and a hero for Indians, because Madhav Rao proves that you don't need white guidance to rule. You don't need white people to govern. Natives can govern themselves. And the British resident at that time says that this minister has been brought in not for anything else, but to fight with the British residency. The residency is essentially where the British ambassador or the British resident would stay in. There would be constant sort of interaction between the royal government and the residency. So even to admit that the Diwan or Madhav Rao has been brought in to fight with the residency is a very clear sort of, it's a confession or an admission of the fact that by bringing in an established native statesman, by bringing in somebody to modernize your administration, you are very consciously trying to minimize the room you give to the British to come and interfere in your government. Tukoji Rao Holkar is merely one example. Now, How exactly did the Rajas resist? It could take all kinds of creative ways. By no means can we argue that the Rajas got on the streets like Gandhiji and had these huge protest marches and street agitation. They did not. And, you can't gloss over that. Ultimately, what won us freedom is that mass galvanization, which is to Gandhiji's credit. But if you look at the overall span of what we call India's colonial experience, it was many layered, had many facets, had many chapters, and many people trying all kinds of different things. And here the Maharajas are interesting because, as I said, they did not meekly sort of lie back and allow the British to do what they wanted. They actually stood up and fought pressures of the British. And that could happen in creative ways. In the state of Gwalior, for example, where in the early 19th century, there was a ruler called Baizabai, a formidable woman, loved riding horses, was quite amused when she met an English woman who used to sit side saddle and she said, "Why are you riding in this peculiar way? Ride properly like we Maratha women do." She controlled a state till the 1840s. The Gwalior state had a very strong economy. It had a lot of money coming in from the opium trade, and it had 40,000 soldiers. So the British couldn't come and bully the rulers of Gwalior as they would have liked. And ultimately, it was through military action that the Gwalior army was sort of disbanded and the British gained greater control over the state. And that happens only in the 1840s. So Baizabai is very confident of her authority. To begin with, she's actually got so much personal wealth of her own, crores of rupees, that she loans money to the East India Company. So she's already got a certain advantage over them. But the other thing is when the British send a resident to her court, this ambassador / representative of theirs, he arrives expecting to be treated as some kind of extraordinary figure. He expects everybody to fall at his feet and be extremely respectful to him. But he arrives and finds that no arrangements have been made for him, not even firewood in his kitchens. It's almost as if the Darbar is just ignoring his arrival. And it was done consciously, it was done deliberately in order to send a political message, which is the Rani was saying that this is actually from one of the British records of that time, where the resident himself says that by showing her autonomy, by showing her complete disdain for the English representative, she was making a statement of her own independence. She was making a statement of her own power. Of course, the British eventually conspire with factions at court and she goes into exile. But even in exile, she's not a weak woman. She moves around with 7,000 people, followers and soldiers. They want her to go and live in Varanasi quietly and she refuses. And instead, after living in various parts of North India, she moves back to the Deccan towards the south, where the British have a very serious fear that she would use her immense financial resources and her influence over the Marathas to actually foment revolt and rebellion. And you have this Governor General writing to her saying that, why are you meeting all these anti-British people? Because they seem to have a direct line to Baizabai. And she, of course, played up gender and her age. And she said, "Oh, I'm such an old woman. Prayers and God are my only interest in life." While she was actually indeed meeting people the British were very uncomfortable with. And they never wanted her to come back to Gwalior. But she orchestrated a return in due course. She used her fortune to, get a later Raja to permit her to come back, and eventually died in the same place that she had to flee many, many years before. Now, this is in the early 19th century. British rule, we often assume, started with the Battle of Plassey and that was it. But it's not quite true. Plassey was in the 1750s. It took till the late 1840s for the Sikh Empire to fall. So for 100 years, that process of empire building was still, an ongoing process, which meant in the early 19th century, a lot of Rajas had room to maneuver. They had room to negotiate. And by no means were they subservient. Even when they did become, let's say, subordinated to the British, the Nizams of Hyderabad, for example, on the one hand, the British were quite in awe of the Nizams because they saw them as the final remnant of the Mughal Empire. They saw the Nizams as the most sort of prestigious leaders of the Muslims in India, so much so that when in World War I, the Ottoman Caliph was removed from his position, the British actually wanted the Nizam to come and make a statement asking Indian Muslims to be loyal to the Raj, as opposed to feeling aggravated by what was happening with their Caliph. And the Nizam agreed to do it. But of course, later he tried to extract something in return. And when that didn't happen, he happily started funding conferences on restoring the Caliph to power. So the Nizam was an important figure. And they therefore couldn't always bully the Nizam in the way they liked. Sometimes certain people did if the Nizam was weak, but a lot of other Nizams, it was difficult to be so direct and blunt. And the Nizams were able to reciprocate through all kinds of interesting strategies. One was ritual. Now we think that ritual is some kind of meaningless thing. These Rajas are so obsessed with ceremonies. They're so obsessed with ritual. They're so obsessed with these frivolous things. But the fact is that if you look at ritual, you realize that that was a platform on which politics was conducted. Ritual was not empty ritual for the sake of ritual. Nobody conducts ritual simply because they feel like it. Even today, when we stand up for the national anthem and we sing the anthem in a certain posture, in a certain form, it has a meaning to it. It has a certain political substance to it. And this is true of the princely states as well. So when the British residents would come and say that, oh, we want to call on the Nizam, but we will wear our shoes on entering the Darbar, the Nizam had every right to say, no, you will not, because wearing shoes was derogatory to his authority. And for 2 generations, the British waged war with the Nizam. Well, not war, but I'm speaking figuratively. But they sort of fought with the Nizam to try and get themselves the right to wear shoes in Darbar. And the Nizam wouldn't allow it. And finally, they succeeded only when there was a young Nizam, a little boy, and there was a regent ruling for him. The regent wanted something else from the British, so they came to an agreement, and that's when the British were finally allowed to wear shoes in the Darbar. Small details. The British residents often fought with the Rajas across states on where the seat of the British resident would be. Now, the British, on the one hand, make fun of the Raja, saying so frivolous, caught up in all these little things. But the fact is, the British also played that same game because they were aware that if they did not play this ritual game, they would end up looking demeaned. So, for instance, when the British resident comes and says that my chair must be on the same level as the throne, in certain states that was allowed because of various historical contingencies. But in other states, they would say no, as happened in Travancore in the 1920s, where a resident wanted to know why the chair was not at the same level as the throne. And the then Rani of Travancore said, because A, it's never been there, and secondly, it's derogatory to the throne. Then the residents would fight on the question of which side the resident's chair should be on. The left side was considered less honorable than the right side. So then they would fight to be on the right side. And of course, the Rajas would insist, no, you must stay on the left because your chair has always been there on the left. This is not petulant behavior. This is not children fighting. These have political significations. In Rajputana, for example, the Maharana of Udaipur always had this habit of feigning diplomatic illnesses every time he had to go to Delhi and meet the British. So he would go to Delhi, and then once he got there, for these Delhi Darbars of 1903, 1911, he would then fall ill very conveniently so that he didn't have to participate in the processions that the Raj expected the Rajas to do, which is, they all get on their elephants and they sort of, look exotic and like tropical exhibits and flatter the British by coming out in all their diamonds and regalia. And Udaipur did not want to do it. And he would feign these illnesses, which again is not a case of princely eccentricity. It has political meaning. Why? Because if he does it, firstly, Udaipur always found he was placed behind the Maharaja of Baroda. And as a Rajput, he always found it somewhat offensive to have to stand behind a Maratha. But more importantly, as I said, in the Rajput political structure, the vassals were extremely powerful, had a lot of influence. And if the Raja went to Delhi in an imperial setting and got himself insulted in a ritual context, placed behind a Maratha ruler whom he thought was inferior to him, made to sort of, join this procession of Rajas when he thought of himself as the Hindu Suraj, as somebody who'd never even bowed to Mughals, if he did that, when he returned to his court, his vassals would try and diminish his authority because he had essentially gone and returned with an insult. And that would make him look bad in the ritual dynamics with his subordinates. His subordinates, in turn, would watch their ritual prerogatives very keenly. For instance, the Raja's cushion, how far is the subordinate's cushion kept? For certain nobles, the Raja will stand up when they arrive, but also, again, when they depart. For others, he will not stand up and depart. Some nobles are so important that the Raja receives them at the gate or the entrance of the palace as opposed to in the Darbar. Even changing minor elements of this. One day the nobleman comes and you decide not to receive him at the gate and to receive him inside. It's an insult. And as I said, it would lead even to armed rebellion. It would lead to other forms of subversion. It could result in the Raja's power being questioned and that whole edifice being challenged. So even ritual was not empty politics. It was actually loaded with meaning. And the British played that game a great deal. They were very distressed when they found the early 1870s that the Maharaja of Gwalior was minting coins with the name of a Mughal emperor as opposed to Queen Victoria. In, I think, Ramnad, they insisted during Navaratri festivities, a portrait of Queen Victoria should also appear because it wasn't just a religious celebration, it was also it had political significance, and Victoria's presence there was extremely important. Victoria herself was often sort of Indianized as Victoria Maharani, and that's how she was often called. And there's a lovely old painting of her done by an Indian artist showing her breastfeeding her infant daughter. Because even in art, she could be Indianized in order to appeal to her Indian allies or the princes. So even these things often had political meanings. And the Rajas would fight back on what to you and me may now seem comical, trivial things. For example, the British insisted that only the British royal family was a royal family. All the Indian Rajas were ruling families, and the rulers were not called kings, they were called princes. But repeatedly you find, and repeatedly the British object to it, the actual governments of the Rajas using terms like royal family, using terms like king, using terms like princess, etc., for junior members of their family, which the British did not allow, and completely flouting what British orders were on these subjects, because for their autonomy, for their self-respect in the eyes of their subjects, for their self-respect in the eyes of their people, they had to stand up to the British. Being submissive and meek would have undermined their own standing in their core domain. As I said, the British may exert pressure on you, but ultimately you're in control of that government, you're in control of that many people in that territory, which means you have to push back, you have to fight in interesting ways to preserve your own turf. And that could happen in all kinds of diverse forms. In Travancore, for example, the deity was the head of the state, Sri Padmanabha Swami. But then, of course, you have the British coming in, and the British are the actual political overlords of the state. And the Rajas face this conundrum where, on the one hand, their idea of Hindu kingship requires them to show conspicuous devotion to the temple, to make donations, to go through these super expensive Hindu rituals like Tula Haram, the Hiranyagarbham, all of which involved a lot of money being spent, the beneficiaries of which were Brahmins. And with good reason, the British came and said, why are you spending so much money on these frivolous rituals? They weren't aware that these are important to kingship, but these are frivolous rituals as far as the British are concerned. So how does the Raja respond? He realizes, and this is by the second half of the 19th century, the Rajas start to realize that the one way to keep the British out of our business is to beat them at their own game. So with hiring Sir T. Madhav Rao, the native statesman of that time, the Raja starts modernizing his administration. He starts building roads, he starts building schools, he starts building tanks and irrigation works. He starts publishing every year in the English language reports about his administration, statistics, numbers. A lot of it is coolly exaggerated because you're only trying to impress the British. It doesn't matter what the reality on the ground is. Although, to be fair, again, it wasn't just the Rajas who did it. The government of India to this day does it. All governments do it. They sort of make their numbers look better than they actually are. And the Raja started churning out this data on how progressive his government is. And by doing that, by spending a large amount on education, he could also get away spending a large amount on the religious side of his kingship, which required him to make donations and gifts to 15,000 Brahmins. By spending on public works, he could also spend on his temple. And by thus balancing this out, he was able to unite a conservative idea of kingship with a progressive idea of kingship. You see this in Mysore as well, where the kings had the Dashara festival, which was not just a religious festival, but something that kings did. It was a kingly festival that was done going back all the way to the Vijayanagara Empire. They continued that, but simultaneously they also started holding an industrial exhibition just to keep the British quiet, which is that, look, simultaneously we have an old form of kingly power, but also a progressive form of kingly power with industrialization happening on the side. So the Rajas came up with means and techniques by which to counter British pressure. And some of this could be done in very shrewd and interesting ways. So Ram Singh of Jaipur, for example, he picked and chose where he wanted to modernize and where he didn't want to modernize. So, for instance, he would modernize in terms of getting railways. He would modernize in terms of roads, gas lights in his capital, set up a school, set up a college. More than happy to do all of that. But he did not modernize his revenue administration. He did not start putting out English language reports about how much his income was and what the state accounts and their statistics were, for the simple reason that he didn't want the British having access to that kind of data. His treaty with the British very clearly said that any revenue above 40 lakh of rupees, the British would get a slice of it. And the Maharaja, for years and years and years, by fudging his accounts and by keeping his revenue management backward, in quotes, by not modernizing it and by not publishing details, he was able to claim revenues of 39 lakhs when his revenue was close to between 50 and 60 lakhs. He was able to save that much money and prevent the British getting a cut simply by fudging his accounts. And how convenient that it was always under that 40 lakh mark. And it was a creative form of resistance. And the thing is, the British were never in enough control to be able to question this or stand up to this. In Jaipur's case, even Ram Singh's successor, in the early 1900s, he made certain donations to some British charities, famine relief, etc. And the British, in an internal record, very clearly say that they are very aware of what the Raja is doing, which is to essentially pay them off here in their charities so that they don't start poking their nose in his actual finances, in his actual internal business. So there was subversion happening even at the level of what kind of information you allow to the British, what kind of ritual politics is allowed, good governance as a means of standing up to British pressure, because the British claimed that they were here to civilize India, they were here to teach Indians to govern. But by turning the tables, yes, you're playing by British rules, yes, you're playing by the idea of progress and the importance of building infrastructure and schools, etc. But by owning that process, by excelling at that process, you're reducing the room the British have for direct intervention in your state. That's why you find a lot of Indians in British India also responding to this. Tilak, for example, his newspaper like the Kesari, every time the British interfered in the Maratha states or in the states in Western India, these nationalist papers of British India would be up in arms because they saw it as an encroachment on the rights of Indians. People would have a direct interest in this. As Sardar K.M. Panikkar, for example, wrote how it was the states that created a school of Indian statesmanship, because in British India, you could join the British Indian colonial service, you could speak the English language, but for the longest time, you couldn't be much more than a glorified secretary to a white man. You would be always appointed in a sort of B-level position, never an actual authority. Whereas if you transferred, so like men like Madhav Rao, Sheshaya Shastri, V. Ramayangar, these were people of the 19th century, they would transfer from British service into the service of a princely state and suddenly start thriving, because suddenly they would be ministers. They would have complete control over their government. And what is interesting is the same men who in the British service would be fairly loyalist in their language. The moment they shifted to the Raja's service, they would start standing up to the British. So, for instance, in Travancore, Sheshaya Shastri found the British were very uncomfortable with allowing the Travancore Raja's judges to try white prisoners and criminals. And he actually fought. He didn't succeed because ultimately the British had more power. But the same man who had come out of the British bureaucracy, after switching to a princely master, was able to stand up. When the British came and said, oh, your government is spending disproportionately on temples, he was able to dig up records from earlier in the century and say that actually the income the state derives from temple lands, which are under the state's control, is far higher than the amount of money we're spending on this. He was even able to write rather blunt letters in which he denounced British policy even in British India, where they wouldn't allow Indian judges to try white criminals. And it was possible for them to do that because the Rajas gave them support and the Rajas gave them platforms by which they could succeed. So in a state like Pudukkottai in Tamil Nadu, when in the 1870s, the Raja had a complete mess at his hands. He was not a capable ruler, a weak ruler, did not have a suitable administrative system, terrible revenues, personal debts, complete nightmare of a situation. And there's a letter where Sir T. Madhav Rao, the native statesman, writes to Sheshaya Shastri, who's just retired from Travancore, and he says, we are natives, and as natives, we cannot but be interested in the welfare and the preservation of the princely states. And this princely state is suffering. This is like a sick patient. And you, Mr. Shastri, are like a doctor. You have experience. Please go and save the state. Because if we Indians in British India do not go and help the Rajas in princely India, the British will come in and take over. They'll come in and assume complete control of the government. To avoid that, it is a duty as Indians to actually step in and play that political role. And Sheshaya Shastri agrees. It's a step down for him. The salary is pretty low, but he agrees because he sees there's a certain principle that matters. There's a certain patriotic principle that is in play. You find Rajas standing up to the British sometimes by using their own legal terminologies and by blending the best of local Indian tradition with what modern world offered. So Krishnaraj Vadiyar III of Mysore, he was installed in power by the British as a 5-year-old in 1799, and he dies only in 1868. So he's there all the way from the end of the 18th century through a good chunk of the 19th century. And he comes to power. In 1830, he's removed from power after 20 years on the throne for misgovernment. And this term misgovernment was used a great deal in the princely states to give the impression that the Rajas didn't know how to rule. But here again, this is why earlier I had mentioned that the internal politics of the princely states also matters, because Krishnaraja Vadiyar ruled over a system where he was the king. The bureaucracy in his state was controlled by Deshastha Brahmins who originally came from Maharashtra. And they had formed a huge vested interest in the bureaucracy. And they often played along with the British resident to reduce the power of the Raja. So the Raja faces pressure not just from the British, but also from his own bureaucracy, which wants to keep him in check to protect its own turf. And the bureaucracy and the British get along. All the same, he also has subjects who are Lingayats and Vokaligas, two important groups that are still important to Karnataka politics. And the Veerashaivas have a history of rebellion against the Vadiyars. Raja, of course, reduces the influence of the British resident, and the British resident is very angry about it. The Raja systematically tries to cut down the influence of the Marathi Brahmin bureaucrats in his government. And by the 1820s, you have a situation where the Marathi Brahmins, they realize that there's also economic depression going on. So peasants, Veerashaiva peasants in a certain area are not very happy with the royal government. They instigate a revolt to put pressure on the Raja. The revolt gets a little out of hand. The British have to move in and they topple the Raja for misgovernment. Now, what's interesting here is that it is both internal dynamics, it is peasant resistance, it is shrewd politics of an entrenched bureaucracy. All of this that comes together in that term misgovernment. In fact, soon after Krishnaraja Vadiya was toppled, the same Governor General who toppled him admitted that it was hasty action, admitted that if there was some financial trouble, it was because of a general economic depression in South India, not because the Raja was bad. And they eventually realized that they had actually treated the Raja poorly. Now, of course, the thing with the British is once they've taken something from you, it's very difficult to actually get it back from them. So the Raja actually waged a war of petitions and legal documents for the next very many decades. 1831, he's removed from power. This is going on all the way to the 1860s. And the British at first say, yes, we've assumed your administration temporarily. We will eventually return it to you. Over time, however, by the 1850s, they start thinking, actually, why should we return it? Let the Raja die. He doesn't have an heir, so we'll just take over the state. Till then, we'll keep paying him an allowance, and that's about it. Krishnaraja Vadiyar, however, has two ways of responding to it. One is there's this wonderful book called Devotional Sovereignty by Caleb Simmons, which you should read, because it talks about how Krishnaraja Vadiyar, he was aware that he no longer controlled government. He did not control land and physical resources of that nature. Yet as a king, he had to stay relevant and retain the loyalty of his subjects. So what did he do? He moved kingship into the realm of religion and spirituality, grand donations to temples, having images of his circulated. So the Veerashaivas had rebelled against him. So paintings of him are done where he's actually wearing the Lingayat Ishtalingam. He's actually sitting in the pose of a Lingayat himself, and he tries to build cultural bridges with them. He uses his vast financial resource to patronize poets, scholars, Sanskrit experts, etc., in order to retain that patronage, that kind of influence that will allow him to have some kind of relevance to local society. Simultaneously, so on the one hand, for one Indian audience, he's got this devotional kingship, this devotional idea of the king, the spiritual idea of the king. The other side, he's also waging this legal war. And he's telling the British that I will also be a legal king. I will now start having these modern institutions. I will now start running my administration in a new format, but return my kingdom to me. They refuse. And eventually this goes all the way to London. And the Raja wins over the head of the British bureaucracy in India because he lobbies people in London and essentially shames people in Parliament into admitting that what was being done to him was unjust. It had been admitted decades before that he should not have been toppled. And pressures put in the British Parliament. Petitions are submitted by Max Muller, J.S. Stewart, some very important intellectuals of that time in the Raja's favor. And it is British government in London, after an election happens and a new government comes in, they are the ones who agree that, yes, Mysore must be returned to the Vadiyars. And this idea of assuming the state once the Raja dies, we're not going to do it. The Raja and the Vadiyars are going to come back to power. And what's interesting is there's this line that the Raja, one of his legal advisors, uses where he says, truth is always truth, whether on the bank of the Thames or whether on the bank of the Ganges or the Ganga in India. Because the Raja essentially scored a moral point over the British establishment in India. The entire colonial establishment in India said he was misgoverning, he was good for nothing, he had lost his chance, the British were going to take over. And he was able to go one step higher than them on a moral count by exposing their injustice, by exposing the fact that they were purely there, not because he had done anything wrong, not because of anything that had to do with justice. They were there simply because they had Mysore, they had its resources, and they didn't want to let go of it. He was able to expose that and win back his government. So that's, one example of the Rajas fighting back. Another is, of course, the famous Sayaji Rao Gaikwad of Baroda. His resistance to the British was far more blunt. It was not necessarily waged through petitions. It was not necessarily waged through legal battles, but quite directly. In his case, he was picked up as a 12-year-old boy when the previous Maharaja of Baroda was deposed in the name of misgovernment. This young boy is picked up. Of course, there's an older claimant for the throne, but the British don't want an older claimant. They are not keen on a grown man because a grown man will stand up to them. So they think, let's bring in a child, a distant relative, because the child is more malleable. He can be trained to be a good ruler, which is essentially code for saying he can be trained to be loyal and submissive to the British. And for years, Sayajirao Gaikwad goes through this interesting educational process where you have Sir T. Madhav Rao, the native statesman I always have mentioned before, who's trying to teach him and give him lessons on how to be not a fully constitutional ruler, but a benevolent despot, to care about the people, to have a progressive government. Then you have an English tutor who's giving him a different set of lectures and exposing him to certain Western ideas. Then you have the British resident who's trying to sort of make sure this chap grows up and is perfectly loyal. And through those years of training, Sayajirao Gaikwad doesn't seem to resist much. He goes through the process quite quietly. But then in 1881, when his installation comes close, the British say, okay, fine, we're going to give you your powers. You're a grown man now. But there are going to be, because you have no experience ruling so far, there are going to be certain limitations on your power for some time. And Sayajirao Gaikwad, who was tutored and trained to be this very loyal, submissive ruler, essentially says, that's fine. I understand that I'm not experienced. I'm happy to live with the limitations, but I need a timeline. The British come back saying, oh, no need. Whenever you feel we can eventually withdraw these restrictions on your power. He says, no, I want a very clear, fixed deadline on when my power is going to be. I'm going to have full power with all these stipulations removed. And it's interesting, if you look at the internal correspondence of that time, the British, just before are praising him for how intelligent he is, how wonderful he is, and how he's been trained and tutored so well. The moment the boy, even on the eve of his installation, shows that he has a spine, the language changes. They start saying, oh, he's a boy we picked up and put on the throne. We're the ones who made him a Raja. He's already getting ideas of this nature. More importantly, they realize that he's in touch with Tukojirao Holkar, who I mentioned earlier in this discussion. And Tukojirao Holkar was, clearly influencing him to stand up to the British. Again, officially, the princes are not supposed to have contacts with each other, but under the radar, obviously, there's connections happening. As time passes, the British get more and more frustrated with Baroda because on the one hand, Maharaja is running an excellent administration. He eventually sets up a representative assembly, plans to set up a university, though that doesn't happen, sets up a bank, compulsory education. Of course, that also didn't fully pan out because a lot of lower caste kids did not actually enter the schools. But the principal, by doing it at a time when the British had actually rejected the idea, he was making a statement. He sets up industrial works and factories, etc. So there's a lot of good things happening in his government, and his finances are perfectly fine. There's no debt, no negative that you can say about his government. So the British have little space to attack him on any of these grounds. So then they start saying that, oh, he's only successfully running an administration because he's actually a man of mediocre intellect. He's just lucky because of the people he appoints to power. May be true, but by appointing R.C. Dutt, a Congress president, by getting his speeches written by Aurobindo, who was a revolutionary turned spiritual guru, he was not, and by interacting with people like Phule, Jyotiba Phule, Gokhale, Tilak, all kinds of M.G. Ranade, people of that nature who were called seditionists. These were the Pune Brahmins, as the British called them, were known to be anti-British. And by directly engaging with them, the Raja was, again, not just making a statement, but also drawing certain intellectual inspirations and ideas. And the British started getting more and more angsty about this. They start seeing the Raja, and you start seeing the word disloyal appearing in the context of the Raja within less than a decade of his time on the throne. But you can't do anything because he's running a successful administration. He eventually gets into trouble in 1911. He goes on for a long time. The British have told all the Rajas, you can't support the Congress party. Of course, behind the scenes, the Rajas are supporting the Congress party. In 1887, the Rajas are told not to give funding to the Congress. 1900 or 1901, when Lord Curzon interrogates the Maharaja of Baroda, Sayajirao, it turns out Sayajirao has still been giving. Sayajirao was one of the Maharajas who donated to Dadabhai Nauroji's election campaign in London. When he traveled abroad, he meets revolutionaries like Madam Kama, Shamji Krishna Varma. Savarkar brothers have a link to his palace, and they were, in that revolutionary phase of the early 1900s. So the British are getting more and more worried about not just the fact that the Raja doesn't seem to care a hoot about what they think, but that he's actually placing his prestige, he's placing his financial resources at the disposal of patently anti-British forces. So at one point, the British raid Baroda and they discover in two areas, and they discover these printing presses where a lot of anti-British propaganda is being printed. One of them is some kind of a bomb-making manual that's, I think, camouflaged under this very innocent title of vegetable medicines. And when they actually pull up the Raja's government and say, how dare you publish this kind of anti-British propaganda here, this contraband. The Raja's government doesn't answer that question. They actually ask a legal point first, which is, on whose authority have you raided Baroda territory? Baroda is a princely state. Without the Maharaja's permission, your Bombay police has no right to enter Baroda. So the British get very aggravated because they think they found the Raja's government with a smoking gun, whereas in reality, the Raja is talking jurisdiction and saying, leave the gun for now. Let's talk jurisdiction first. So that's one element. Then they find that of 167 proscribed and banned publications in India, some 17 have emerged just from Baroda, this one princely state. As I said, whenever the Raja travels, he seems to be mingling with the wrong sort. And there's a time when the British, when revolutionary stuff is picking up in the 1900s, the British actually have this moment where they want the Raja to give a speech, sort of saying that revolutionary activities are bad and violence is not the answer to anything. And the Raja gives the speech, but he also adds that the core problem must be addressed. Now, the core problem is what? British rule and the fact that people are dissatisfied. So again, the British are not pleased. And I think one of the worst was when the Viceroy himself came to Baroda. On the way, he survived an assassination attempt. And yet, when he came to Baroda, he saw graffiti. He heard of graffiti on the walls which said, you may bring all the armies and soldiers you like, but that will not dissuade us from our cause. So this is happening. On the face of it, Baroda Maharaja is one of the top 5 princes of India, a loyal ally of the Raj. When he goes to London, he meets the British King, Queen Victoria, when he was younger. All of that is happening. He was even tutored and trained by the British to be loyal. But in actual practice, he proves to be completely against the British. Of course, in 1911, they finally have him where they want him. At the Delhi Darbar of 1911, he's accused of insulting the British king, which is by walking up and turning around and showing the king his back instead of bowing 7 times and then, retreating without showing your back. The fact is, other rulers also did it. But there was this huge press campaign specifically targeting Baroda, specifically attacking and vilifying him, which was essentially, it was creating a mood to justify his deposition. That is when Sayajirao Gaikwad finally tones down his language a little bit. After that, he realizes that, ultimately standing up to the British is important, but you can't do much if you've been pushed off the throne. So he realizes that let me at least keep my throne. And for the second phase of his career, he doesn't directly, bluntly say things, but he finds other ways of getting his message across, other ways of supporting the Indian nationalists, etc., which is to get his officials to say it, to get his diwan to write a letter complaining about interference by the British. He finds other techniques by which to stand up to the British. And I know we're running out of time, and because we're sitting on, this is hosted in Bangalore, I think I'll end with the example of Mysore. The Mysore Rajas, again, we saw Krishnaraja Wadiyar and his legal form of resistance. We saw Sayajirao Gaikwad and his very direct form of resisting the British. But in Mysore, there was this other form of also standing up to the British and making a statement, which was a form of economic nationalism. The Rajas, once after Krishnaraja's great legal battles, the state was finally returned to the Wadiyars in 1881 to his adopted heir. And this Raja realized, that firstly, the British had just taken away the state. So the Rajas couldn't get as adventurous as Sayajirao Gaikwad in Baroda could, for example. So the Rajas came up with a brand of economic nationalism that was focused on industrialization. Why? Because in states like Travancore, etc., the Rajas had already shown that Indian Rajas could also put up roads, schools, and run good, healthy, financially strong governments. But Mysore wanted to go one step further. They wanted to make a point in the realm of industrialization because, again, natives are not supposed to have been good at science. They were not supposed to be good at technology. They needed guidance. So by supporting the Indian Institute of Science, by setting up iron and steel works, by setting up one of the biggest dams in the world, the Rajas were making a kind of political statement. And the political statement struck in the sense that even Gandhiji, who was no great friend of machines, actually, in one of his Young India writings, he talks about what Mysore's industrial experiments do make a political point. They are important in showing that natives are also capable of having that scientific spirit. The Mysore government pumped money into these projects, like the iron and steel works, for years and years and years and years. It did not turn a profit. It was a white elephant that was into which a huge chunk of the state's resources were being sunk. It was, there was a lot of loans being taken, etc. The Maharaja's point was never profit. The point was never about turning a profit and making money. The point was a political point. It was about making a statement. By the 1940s, in fact, the Mysore government was considering a proposal. It didn't go through, but the Mysore government was considering a proposal where they wanted to set up an automobile manufacturing unit in Mysore, which is to say a princely state in India setting up a car manufacturing unit, unheard of and extremely ambitious. And these were things that the British did not like because they did not like the Rajas excelling at things like this. Now, on the face of it, again, Mysore Raja has his Dashara, sits on elephants, dresses in a traditional way, but he's also running a regime that is obsessed with industrialization. That has other consequences, of course. The huge funneling of resources from, let's say, village activities and health and other areas that desperately need them into this technocratic dream of setting up big industries in Mysore. It leads to other social complications. It leads to political turmoil, etc. But Mysore is held up as a great image of native capacity, so much so that the same Sardar Patel, who in 1949 integrates the Indian princely states, says that they're essentially like ulcers in India. In 1929, in a speech in Mysore, he actually says that the rulers of Mysore have done an excellent job. And if certain congressmen in Mysore were agitating, and he basically told them, if you're still dissatisfied, the problem is probably with you, not with the ruler. Gandhiji, till the mid-1930s, Gandhiji was writing that, interfering in the princely states is like interfering in Afghanistan or Sri Lanka. The Congress should not go there. He had regard and respect for a lot of rulers. The Maharani of Travancore, he compared her to Lakshmi and said her simplicity she was even more simple than he was. Maharaj of Mysore, he called her Rajarishi and compared Mysore to Ram Raja. As late as the 1930s, the princes were seen as respectable figures. The princes had an incentive in supporting the nationalists. States like Mysore, etc., completely basked in the glory of the praise that the Congress party was giving them, because it gave them legitimacy. It gave them a certain kind of aura in the eyes of their own countrymen. What changes, and this is the final chapter of British rule in India, is that by the mid-1930s, the dynamics change. There's, of course, the British have given the Rajas a seat at the table. They're part of the round table conferences. The British are designing what they call a federation in which the princely states also have a place. The nationalists are also willing at that time to allow, not all nationalists, Nehru and the socialist flank perhaps not, but the others were still willing to speak to the Rajas and see them as legitimate factors at the table. In 1935, the British start allowing Congress and other parties in India a share of power. So by the 1937 elections in that year, you find Congress governments in the provinces holding ministries, holding important positions, and starting to participate in a form of democratic government in the country. This is where people in the princely states also start coming up with similar demands. And now the Rajas sort of hesitate, because obviously the Raja does not want to give up all of his power. They have legislative councils and representative assemblies, but these are always slightly, they don't have that much power. And the Raja doesn't want to clip his own wings. So the Raja starts resisting this. More importantly, local politicians who've been fighting elections, fighting local politics on the basis of communalism, caste, religious issues locally, they start realizing that one way to pressure the Raja and punch above their weight is to associate with the Congress. The Congress of the late 1930s has no footprint in the princely states. To construct a footprint in the princely states, they need the local politicians. So the two come together. One gets the prestige and the umbrella of the Congress. The other gets representation in the princely states. And they come together, and the Rajas are completely befuddled. Till yesterday, you're financing the Congress and enjoying praise from the Congress. Suddenly, you're getting criticism, and your politicians who you're trying to control have joined up with the Congress. So now the Rajas start becoming more and more repressive, whether it's Mysore, whether it's Travancore, or a bunch of other states in North India as well. Now they start becoming more and more violent. Now they start becoming more and more autocratic. And the image of them as benevolent rulers who represented native capacity to govern is replaced. The idea of them as anachronisms who do not have a place in future India, in post-colonial India, who are resisting the march of democracy and modern ideas. Then, of course, federation negotiations fail. World War II comes, that alters things globally. So the Rajas and their capacity to negotiate is reduced. And by 1947, both the British and the Congress have far bigger things to worry about. One is partition, the Muslim League, huge issues, and the demands of the Raja start looking more and more petty and small. And the Rajas, of course, they're also, they have a congenital problem in lobbying together. None of them gets along with each other. As I said, Rajput will not sit with the Maratha. The Nizam will not sit with a junior Nawab. All of them think that they are distinct and special and have their own unique identities. So by failing to band together, they essentially lose momentum. They lose the initiative over there. And in the end, the same Sardar Patel who used to praise some of the big Rajas sits over their heads with a carrot in one hand and a stick in the other. And most Rajas sign off their rights. But they retain influence. We often think of the privy purses as just these little bribes that were given to the Rajas to sort of get them to sign on the dotted line. No, I think it's important to recognize the privy purses as an acknowledgement that the Rajas had political status, they had political legitimacy. A lot of people admired and respected them. Their subjects, in many cases, loved and sort of were loyal to them. Giving them that money, allowing them to retain those privileges, they were actually a good bargain for the Indian state because it purchased the accession of these states. It purchased the unification of the country for actually a relatively small price. And of course, the abrogation of the privy purses, although it was Indira Gandhi's socialist turn may have had something to do with it, it may also have been the fact that the Rajas were using money they were getting from the government of India, which Indira Gandhi thought was Indira Gandhi, and using that money to support opposition parties and to support non-socialist parties, etc., which aggravated Mrs. Gandhi. So in a sense, just as they used their resources when they were rulers to sort of, needle the British from behind, after independence, they seem to be doing that to Mrs. Gandhi and the Congress party, and the privy purses were abolished. I won't go into that. I think I've already spoken for far longer than I intended, but the overall argument really, including of my book, False Allies, which released recently, is this, which is that the Rajas were political figures. They had political personalities. They were not chamkas sitting around in silks and watching dancing girls all day long. There were multiple strategies by which colonialism was resisted in our country. It was not street agitation in the final phase is the big chunk, but the previous 60, 70 years, they are by no means insignificant. The overlaps between Congress and the Rajas, nationalists and the Rajas, intellectuals in British India and the Rajas, all of this is also part of our history during the colonial period. And if we are to obtain a complete picture of modern Indian history, we must look beyond the caricatures, we must look beyond the stereotypes and take the princely states seriously, because only then, by ignoring 40% of the country that was ruled by the Rajas and making the narrative purely about the 60% under British rule, we're also cutting away 40% of our own history and 40% of some very, very interesting stories that tell us about nationalism, imperialism, our past, our identity, and in many cases, even present-day politics. So thank you, and I'll stop with that.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, please share it with family and friends. You can also leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible are Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studios. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to get regular updates on our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.